The gas lamps of Beacon Hill do not illuminate. They conspire. On the night of October 27, 1889, they surrendered to a cold, predatory fog that slithered from the harbor, swallowing sound and sight, muffling the clip-clop of the last horse-drawn carriages and leaving the world a stage of murky suggestion. Inside the Boston Athenaeum, a fortress of silence and old money, a man with hands as pale and steady as marble slid a heavy, leather-bound volume back into its designated space on a high shelf. He wore a cashmere greatcoat, the collar turned up, smelling faintly of expensive tobacco and the damp wool. His movements were an exercise in practiced invisibility, each step measured, each breath controlled. He did not look at the other patrons, lost in their worlds of print and privilege. His focus was singular. He adjusted his silk cravat, a flash of deep crimson in the amber light, and cast one final, proprietary glance toward a secluded reading alcove. At the mahogany desk, a single sheet of paper lay starkly white against the dark wood, its surface a chaotic lattice of what appeared to be frantic geometric scribbles. Beside it, a single, unadorned fountain pen rested, its nib still, glistening with wet black ink. He allowed himself a small, thin smile of completion before turning. His footsteps, unlike the clumsy shuffles of academics, made no sound on the thick Persian rugs as he moved through the labyrinth of 10,000 silent stories and vanished back into the fog he seemed to command. By morning, the city's whispers would find a name: Eleonora Vance. She had, according to the official report, simply ceased to be, vanished from a room that the night watchman swore was locked from the inside. No windows were disturbed. No furniture was overturned. It was as if a master librarian had deaccessioned a problematic text, removing it from the catalog so completely that its very existence became a matter of debate. The Boston police, at the firm urging of unseen but influential voices, would close the case with indecent haste, branding it a flight of fancy, the sad, predictable end for a young woman of sharp intellect and brittle nerves, haunted by her family's ruin. But this was not an escape, nor was it the work of a troubled mind. It was a precise, metaphysical execution. It was an erasure. And the men who held the pen, who moved through the city's veins like a secret blood, would ensure that the story of Eleonora Vance was a book that would never again be opened out to understand the erasure. You must first understand the woman they sought to erase. Eleonora Vance was a ghost long before she disappeared. She was the daughter of Professor Alistair Vance, a man who walked the razor's edge of genius and madness. His work at Harvard, in the 1870s on what he termed causal sympathy and etheric resonance fields, was revolutionary. He theorized that history was not a linear path, but a shimmering, multi-layered fabric, and that great events, battles, discoveries, disasters left behind a kind of energetic residue in the physical objects present, an echo in the ether. His colleagues at first saw it as brilliant, if eccentric, metaphor, but when Vance began to propose that these echoes could be measured, that the fabric could be intentionally plucked or torn, they branded him a heretic. The attack was systematic and vicious. A series of scathing articles, penned by anonymous concerned academics, appeared in scholarly journals, reframing his physics as parlor trick occultism. He was goaded into public debates he was temperamentally unsuited for, his complex ideas easily caricatured and ridiculed by lesser but more theatrical minds. Funding was pulled. Access to laboratories was denied. Within 2 years, the most promising mind of his generation was reduced to a pariah, a broken shell of a man who wandered the paths of the Boston Common, muttering to himself about anchors in time and the tyranny of consensus reality. Eleonora watched it all. She saw the orchestrated nature of it, the surgical precision of the knives that cut her father down. She inherited his piercing intellect, but hers was not the gentle curiosity of a scholar. It was the cold, focused fury of an avenger. After her father's death from what the doctors called a wasting grief, she lived a life of deliberate shadow, surviving on a meager inheritance. Her presence in the city's libraries and archives a tolerated anomaly. She was a phantom in the hallowed halls her father could no longer enter, absorbing knowledge not for its own sake, but as an arsenal. She taught herself cryptography, metallurgy, ancient languages, and most importantly, she completed her father's work in secret, translating his dense equations into a practical, terrifying new science. She was hunting the men who had orchestrated her family's demise, a secret society of Boston's elite she had only heard her father whisper about in his final, paranoid days, the Ethelberg Society. The Ethelberg Society was the hidden gearwork in the grand clock of New England power. Its existence was a rumor, a ghost story told by the city's have-nots to explain their misfortune. But it was very real. They did not convene in public halls, but in a purpose-built sanctum dug into the cold granite bedrock beneath Beacon Hill, accessible only to those who knew the precise sequence of pressures to apply to the wine racks in the cellar of the exclusive St. Botolph Club. The air within was unnaturally still and cold, smelling of damp earth, ionized air from their strange devices, and the cloying scent of absolute secrecy. Their leader, the man who had orchestrated Professor Vance's downfall, was Alastair Finch, a shipping and railroad magnate whose face was a mask of cold, patrician certainty. Finch's obsession with control was born from his own history. As a young man, his family fortune had been nearly wiped out by a freak fire at the port of Boston, an event of pure chance that had instilled in him a pathological hatred of randomness. When he was inducted into the Ethelberg Society, he found his life's purpose. He reshaped it from a passive club of esoteric historians into an active force. Their philosophy was simple and terrifying. History was a disease, and chance was its vector. Their cure was control. They collected not art, but causal anchors, physical objects that had witnessed moments of great historical energy. In their sanctum, displayed in lead-lined cases, were items like a handful of bent nails from a Salem courthouse torn down in 1693, a silken handkerchief stained with the sweat of a financier during the Panic of 1873, a lead musket ball dug from the wall of a house at Concord. They believed these artifacts held a causal charge, and through rituals involving harmonic resonators and focused psionic energy, they could link this charge to a contemporary target. They were pruning the timeline, removing inconvenient people and undesirable events, all to cultivate a world that favored their interests. Professor Vance hadn't just stumbled upon their secret. He had independently discovered the physics behind it. To Finch, this made him the most dangerous man in the world. He was not just a rival. He was a competing god, not Eleonor. I knew that the walls of the Ethelberg Society were sealed by power and money, impenetrable to any direct assault. Her only way in was through a mind. She found her vector in Julian Croft, the youngest son of a banking dynasty, a new and eager inductee into a society. Julian was unlike the cold-blooded pragmatists like Finch. He possessed a romantic soul, drawn to the society's mystique and its promise of forbidden knowledge, yet he was secretly troubled by its chilling amorality. He saw the power, but felt the darkness. Eleonora identified this fissure in his character and began a campaign of intellectual seduction with the patience and precision of a master spy. She engineered their first meeting in the comparative theology section of the public library, a space the sons of industry rarely frequented. She was reading a rare Gnostic text, and when he passed, she asked him a question of such startling erudition that he was immediately intrigued. Over weeks of chance encounters, she built a careful intimacy. She never flirted in the conventional sense. She challenged his ideas, completed his thoughts, and discussed the grand sweep of history with a passion that made his societies dry. Methodical manipulations seemed like crude vandalism by comparison. To Julian, who had spent his life in a gilded cage where conversation revolved around profit margins and yachting, Eleonora was a draught of pure, intoxicating oxygen. He began to confide in her, desperate to impress this brilliant, enigmatic woman with the scope of his secret world. He spoke of the society's beliefs, their rituals, their sanctum, framing it all as a noble endeavor to bring order to a chaotic world. Eleonora listened, her expression one of rapt fascination, while every word he spoke was meticulously recorded in her coded journal. She felt a sliver of pity for him. He was a pawn, mesmerized by the grandeur of a game he didn't truly understand. But her pity was a shallow sea next to the deep ocean of her resolve. He was her key, and she would turn him in the lock until it either opened or broke. While Eleonora was forging her weapon, the man who would become her only posthumous ally was walking his beat. Detective Michael Harding of the Boston Police was a man of inconvenient principles. A second-generation Irish immigrant, he had fought his way into a department dominated by Yankee patronage, earning his shield through a grim, methodical tenacity that made his superiors uneasy. He had a long memory and a deep-seated distrust of the city's Brahmin elite. Born from a past case, the suspicious death of a union organizer that had been swiftly and ruthlessly buried by men in expensive coats. When the file for Eleonora Vance landed on his desk weeks after her disappearance, it was already a dead letter. The report was a masterpiece of dismissive prose, barely 2 pages long, concluding with a diagnosis of female hysteria and probable flight from the city. The signature of the police commissioner himself was on the closure order, but Harding saw the holes, the locked room, the lack of any travel preparations, the family's history. It was too neat, too clean. He began a quiet, off-the-books inquiry, a process he called pulling at the thread. He spent his own money buying drinks for night watchmen and librarians, collecting whispers. It led him, inevitably, to the abandoned Vance residence, a narrow, sad-looking brownstone choked with weeds. The air inside was stale with grief and dust. He walked through the rooms, noting the Spartan, almost monastic existence Eleonora had led. There were books everywhere, stacked on floors, chairs, even the hearth. It was in her bedroom, beneath a loose floorboard his experienced eye had caught, that he found it. A small leather-bound journal. It wasn't locked. It didn't need to be. The pages were filled with a script that was utterly alien and dense. Elegant web of astronomical symbols, Greek letters, and complex mathematical notations. It was not the diary of a runaway. Harding, holding the book in his calloused hands, felt a profound, professional chill. This was evidence. This was a story. And he knew, with the certainty of a man who had looked into the abyss before, that the story it told was one that powerful men had already decided would never be read. Harding knew he was out of his depth. The cipher was beyond him. He sought out the one man in Boston he thought could help. Dr. Robert Pembroke, a retired professor of ancient languages and philology from Harvard. Pembroke was a cantankerous recluse who had been a close friend of Alastair Vance before his public shaming, and he harbored a quiet, simmering resentment toward the academic establishment that had cast his friend out. When Harding presented him with the journal, Pembroke's tired eyes lit up with a familiar fire. "My God," he whispered, tracing a symbol with a trembling finger. "It's Alastair's shorthand, but she's evolved it. She's turned it into a language." For weeks, the two men worked in secret in Pembroke's dusty, book-lined study, fueled by cheap whiskey and a shared sense of righteous indignation. As they began to peel back the layers of the cipher, a horrifying picture emerged. Eleonora's journal was a detailed ethnography of a death cult. They translated one entry that described a ritual in chilling detail, They call it the pruning. She wrote, "Last night, the target was a shipping competitor of Finch's. They brought forth the anchor, a rusted iron rivet recovered from the wreck of the rig, steamship Atlantic in 1873, a disaster that claimed over 500 souls. Finch placed the rivet at the heart of the resonator, a device of brass and quartz that hums with a sickening low-frequency energy. The members formed their circle, focusing their intent, their collective will, on the name of the target company. They are not praying to a god. They are singing a song of ruin, using the resonance of a past tragedy to call forth a new one." Julian watched with pride. I watched with the cold sickness of a physician diagnosing a plague. The journal chronicled half a dozen such prunings. Eleonora had meticulously cross-referenced each ritual with subsequent events: fires, bankruptcies, sudden political scandals, inexplicable deaths. The correlation was perfect. The Ethelberg Society wasn't just a group of powerful men playing with strange toys. They had operationalized a dark miracle. They had weaponized history itself, deeper. Within the translated journal, Harding and Pembroke discovered the true object of Eleonora's quest. It was not just about exposing the society. It was about reclaiming a specific artifact, the heart of their power and the instrument of her father's destruction. She called it the Veritas Compass. It was a small, palm-sized device, its casing, carved from a single piece of polished obsidian. Its needle was not magnetized iron, but a sliver of an iron-nickel meteorite, and it did not point north. According to Eleonora's entries, quoting Julian's proud explanations, the compass responded to fluctuations in the etheric field. It pointed toward causal weaknesses, the points of highest probability, the fault lines in an individual's life or an organization's structure where a small push could trigger a catastrophic collapse. It was the society's targeting system. The journal revealed the compass's origin with heart-wrenching clarity. It was her father's greatest invention. He had built it not as a weapon, but as a diagnostic tool, a way to map the unseen currents of causality he believed shaped the world, hoping to one day predict and prevent disasters. The Ethelberg Society had stolen it from his laboratory. The same night, a forged letter, outlining his mental breakdown, was sent to the university's board. Eleonora remembered the compass from her childhood. She wrote of her father letting her hold it, the obsidian cool against her skin, the needle quivering as if alive. He had called it his truth seeker. This transformed her mission from one of vengeance to one of sacred reclamation. The compass was the last untainted piece of her father's legacy, and it was being perverted for the darkest of purposes. Her resolve hardened. She knew she had to retrieve it, not just to disarm them, but to redeem him. This personal stake, this deep, emotional core to her mission, made her infinitely more dangerous. She wasn't just fighting an idea. She was fighting for her father's soul. Eleonora's strategy shifted. Her conversations with Julian became more focused, more dangerous. She pressed him for details about the sanctum's defenses, the specific timing of their rituals, and the protocols surrounding the Veritas compass. Julian, blinded by his intellectual fascination with her, at first answered freely. But even he could not ignore the change in her questioning. The scholarly curiosity that had so captivated him was being replaced by a kind of cold, tactical urgency. The breaking point arrived on a raw, windswept afternoon in late October, during a walk in the Granary burying ground. Surrounded by the dead of colonial Boston, the air thick with history, he finally confronted her. "Eleonora, this is no longer a philosophical inquiry," he said, his voice low and trembling. "You ask about guard rotations, about the resonator's power source. What is it you are truly planning?" The moment hung between them, as silent and heavy as the granite tombs. Eleonora, seeing the nascent fear and betrayal in his eyes, knew her deception had run its course. Her time was up. In her journal's final frantic entry, she described the desperate gamble she took. She told him a carefully curated version of the truth. She revealed her identity as Alistair Vance's daughter. She told him the society had stolen her father's work and destroyed him. She confessed that the compass was her birthright, and she pleaded with him, not as an accomplice, but as a man of conscience, to help her reclaim it. They are perverting a science that could have benefited humanity, she argued, her words a final, desperate play for the sliver of good she still believed existed in him. Help me right this one wrong. Help me take back the only piece of my father I have left. Julian stared at her, his face pale, his mind a battlefield of loyalty, fear, and a dawning, terrible understanding of how completely he had been deceived. He said nothing. He simply turned and walked away, leaving her alone among the graves, the fate of her mission, and her life resting entirely on the choice he would make next. The night of October 27th was starless, the sky a suffocating blanket of black. It was the night of the Ethelbert Society's autumnal equinox ritual, their most sacred and powerful meeting of the year. This was the night Eleonora had planned. 4. Her journal, which she must have hidden before leaving, laid out the audacious, near-suicidal details. Whether Julian helped her, betrayed her, or simply did nothing, we now know she proceeded alone. She used her knowledge of the cities, hidden pathways, a skill learned from her father's historical maps, to access a long-forgotten service tunnel connecting the Athenaeum sub-basement to the foundation of the adjacent St. Botolph Club. The journey was a descent into a cold, damp blackness, the air thick with the smell of wet earth and decay. She moved with a silent, practiced grace, a single candle her only light. But Julian had made his choice. He had gone to Alistair Finch. Perhaps he believed Finch would merely have Eleonora warned away, her access to the libraries revoked. He could not have conceived of the Society's true ruthlessness. They were waiting for her. When Eleonora emerged from the tunnel into the antechamber of the wine cellar, she was not met with surprise, but with a silent, assembled reception. Alistair. Finch stood at the center, flanked by two of his most loyal members, their faces grim and impassive in the flickering gaslight. It was not an ambush. It was a tribunal. They didn't drag her into their sanctum. They led her. They wanted her to see the full scope of their power before they extinguished her. Down in the cold, humming chamber, they showed her the Veritas compass resting on its velvet cushion. Your father was a fool. Finch's voice was devoid of emotion, a scalpel of a voice. He found the key to reality, but was afraid to open the door. We are not. They forced her to watch as they began their ritual, intending to make her the subject of their pruning, to link her to some forgotten tragedy and let causality erase her. It was the ultimate act of psychological cruelty. They were showing her the very weapon that would unmake her, a final, terrible confirmation of her failure. Detective Harding's attempt to pursue the truth was like punching water. The system, seamless and silent, closed ranks around the Ethelbert Society. His request for the St. Botolph Club's visitor logs for the month of October was denied, citing member privacy. The night watchman from the Athenaeum, who had initially told Harding he'd seen a carriage without livery waiting near the club for over an hour on the 27th, suddenly recanted his statement, claiming the fog was too thick to have seen anything clearly. His memory, he said, must have been mistaken. Harding's partner was quietly reassigned to a mundane fraud case in a different precinct. Then came the direct warning. He was summoned to the office of the police commissioner, a man whose political ambitions were an open secret. The commissioner, without looking up from his paperwork, told Harding that his morbid fascination with the Vance case was unproductive and reflected poorly on the department. She was an unstable woman from a disgraced family, the commissioner said, his voice smooth as polished granite. The matter is closed. Continuing to pry would be a profound career error, detective. The threat was unmistakable. Harding knew his badge, his pension, and possibly his physical safety were on the line. He was forced to officially abandon the case, his files stamped and archived, his furious detailed notes relegated to a locked drawer in his desk at home. The official narrative was now set in stone, reinforced by a small, carefully placed article in the Boston Herald that spoke of the tragic legacy of the Vance family and their proclivity for mental instability. The erasure was almost complete. They had not only removed Eleonora from the world, they had poisoned her memory, ensuring that even if her name was ever spoken, it would be associated only with madness and failure. It was a masterclass in the exercise of invisible power. Alistair, Finch, and his society believed they had achieved a total victory. They had weathered the threat, eliminated the threatener, and reclaimed the narrative. Their secret was safe. Their power was absolute. But in their arrogance, they had overlooked the single, most crucial element of their encounter with Eleonora Vance. They failed to understand their opponent's endgame. They assumed she was playing their game, a game of control, power, and survival. They never imagined she was playing an entirely different game, one with a single ultimate stake: justice. The strange geometric drawing she left on the desk at the Athenaeum was not a cry for help or a final defiant message. It was a trigger. Using her father's completed physics, Eleonora had performed her own final ritual before walking into their trap. She had discovered that the Veritas compass, by its very nature, could not only find causal weaknesses, but could also create a permanent link, a sympathetic bond between itself and a living subject. She had turned the Society's targeting system into a recording device. She had linked her own life force, her own resonant, causal frequency, to the obsidian compass. She had turned herself into the ultimate causal anchor. When the Society took the compass back into their sanctum, they were not securing a weapon. They were installing a ghost in their own machine. For years, nothing happened. The Society prospered. But then the echoes began. In 1893, a banker in the Society who had used a ritual to trigger a small financial panic to ruin a rival was himself utterly destroyed in the Great Panic of 1893, dying penniless. In 1895, a judge who had helped quash Harding's investigation was undone by a blackmail scandal so perfectly mirroring one they had engineered years before that it defied all probability. One by one, the members of the Ethelberg Society were consumed by perfect, ironic justice. They were being killed by their own history, hunted down by the ghosts of their own crimes, with Eleonora's silent, patient consciousness now acting. As the unforgiving conductor of the symphony, the Society dissolved not with a bang, but with a protracted, paranoid whimper. The members grew to fear their own rituals, their own power. They saw the echoes everywhere. They distrusted one another, each suspecting the others of turning their dark science against them. Alistair Finch, the architect of it all, was the last to go. He died in 1910, a withered, terrified recluse in his waterfront mansion. His staff reported that in his final years, he was haunted by a sound no one else could hear, a faint, persistent scratching coming from inside the lead-lined vault where he kept the Veritas compass. He died in his bed, his eyes wide with a terror that the attending physician noted was unlike any natural fear. Julian Croft, the man whose weakness had precipitated the end, lived a long, prosperous, and exquisitely tormented life. The Society's fall from grace ironically secured his family's financial dominance, but he was a hollow man. He never married. He had no children. He lived in a state of constant, quiet penance. Finally, on his deathbed in 1948, the guilt became unbearable. He dictated a full confession to his private nurse, a rambling, desperate testament detailing the society, their rituals, Finch's crimes, and his own cowardly betrayal of Eleanora Vance. "I didn't know what they would do," he whispered, his voice a dry rasp. "I thought they would simply send her away, but Finch, he enjoyed it. He wanted her to see the machine before it consumed her. And now I hear it too. The scratching." His confession was sealed by his estate lawyers, with instructions that it not be opened for 50 years. When it was finally unsealed in the autumn of 1998, it was a historical bombshell, giving names, dates, and corroboration for a conspiracy that had, until then, been nothing more than a ghost story. It was the truth, delivered half a century. Too late for any legal justice. But Eleanora Vance had never been seeking the justice of men. The rediscovery of the Ethelberg Society through Croft's confession sent a ripple through the quiet world of academic history. It became a specialized, almost forbidden topic. Most scholars treated it as a fascinating case study in elite paranoia and occultism. But a very few, saw something more. They saw a pattern, a methodology of power that didn't die with Alistair Finch. They saw the society not as an anomaly, but as a prototype. Was it possible that others had stumbled upon similar principles? That new societies, armed with more modern tools, continued the work of pruning the timeline? Whispers emerged of powerful financial syndicates whose rivals suffered from statistically impossible streaks of bad luck, of political movements that collapsed overnight from perfectly timed, inexplicable scandals. The story of Eleanora Vance became a cautionary tale for a new generation of researchers digging into the dark corners of power. They called it the Vance Protocol, the idea that any organization that seeks to manipulate reality will eventually fall victim to the complexities and unforeseen consequences of its own actions. The Veritas Compass, now officially catalogued as the Vance Artifact, still sits in a climate-controlled vault at the university. It is an object of intense, if quiet, fascination. In 2003, a team of physicists was granted permission to study it with modern sensors. The project was abruptly canceled after 2 weeks. The official reason was equipment malfunction. The unofficial rumor was that every sensitive instrument they brought near the compass produced nothing but white noise, and that the lead researcher resigned his tenure and moved to a monastery in rural Vermont shortly thereafter. The compass remains cool and silent and black, an object that defies explanation, a permanent fixture in the material world, just as its creator intended. If you believe that some truths are written not in ink, but in blood, and that knowledge itself can be a weapon, subscribe to the Sealed Room, because the deepest secret of Eleanora Vance's story is not historical, but scientific. The geometric drawings she left behind, long dismissed as the ravings of a troubled mind, was finally analyzed in the early 2000s by a theoretical physicist at Caltech named Dr. Aries Thorne. He had no knowledge of the historical context. He was simply given a high-resolution image of the diagram as a historical cryptographic puzzle. His findings, published in a niche journal of theoretical physics, were staggering. He identified it as a complete, elegant equation for what he termed a self-sustaining, recursive causal loop. "The mathematics are flawless," Thorne wrote. The equation describes a method for anchoring a localized quantum state, in this case, hypothetically, a human consciousness to an external physical object. The anchor then acts as a perfect mirror for any directed causal energy. In essence, whatever you do to the anchor, or do with the anchor, is perfectly and symmetrically reflected back upon the user over time. It wouldn't be immediate. The feedback would be subtle, building within the system, expressing itself through what would appear to be chance or bad luck, but is in fact a perfect, deterministic echo. It's a feedback loop of fate. It's the most elegant and terrifying formula for revenge I have ever seen. Thorne, of course, believed it to be a purely theoretical exercise. He had no idea that nearly 120 years earlier, a 24-year-old woman, working by candlelight with her murdered father's notes, had not only theorized it, but had enacted it. She had turned herself into a law of physics. So we are left with the ghost. Not a spectral image rattling chains in an attic, but a far more terrifying kind of spirit. A ghost of pure consequence. Eleanora Vance died in 1889, but she did not perish. She achieved a different kind of immortality, a chilling, poetic justice written into the fabric of reality itself. She became the silent, unseen auditor for the two. Debts of men who believed they were above all ledgers. Her story forces us to ask unsettling questions. Was her final act one of heroic sacrifice, or the creation of a perfect, cold-blooded murder weapon? In becoming the instrument of their downfall, did she embrace the very darkness she sought to destroy, becoming a monster to fight monsters? Perhaps she proved that the only way to truly defeat a system built on a foundation of hidden, unnatural laws is to become a more fundamental, more inescapable law yourself. She did not seek to restore the world to what it was. She sought to balance the scales. And the scales of history, once balanced with blood, tend to stay that way. The faint, rhythmic pulse that guards sometimes report hearing from the university vault is not a heartbeat. It is a metronome, patiently, eternally, keeping time, waiting for the next hand to reach for a power it does not understand. What would you have done if you knew? Leave your answer below and subscribe to The Sealed Room, where every locked door eventually opens.